Education Director and Trainer. Welcome. My name is Charles Woods, and I'm the Education Director and Trainer at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. And we want to thank the NAACP Legal Defense Fund for offering us to be able to speak on the topic at hand today. And so I will get started with our mission statement. The Birmingham Civil Rights Institute's mission statement is to enlighten each generation about civil and human rights by exploring our common past and working together in the present to build a better future. And today we have a very unique discussion that we're going to be covering today. And the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute prides itself on being the place to have these difficult conversations, the place to have these difficult interactions so that we can move forward as a society in this country. And so today we're going to be talking about the rise in legislation throughout the country, about public education institutions and what they're teaching our students. There's been a rise in legislation passed to ban the teaching of diversity, inclusion, and equity topics, also known as critical race theory, in our schools throughout this country, including the state of Alabama. And so today we're going to talk with some colleagues of mine, and we're going to get down to what exactly these bans are and why they're happening, and also talk about what it looks like in the classroom. And so I'd like to introduce first our civil rights fellow. His name is John Paul. He's also a doctoral candidate in educational policy from the University of Iowa. And he's going to help us understand what this ban is and talk with us about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how do we move forward with this topic. And so, John Paul.
Oh, first of all, thank you very much for having me today. It's an honor to be here. These bans or these ideas of suppressing dialogues around race have been popping up for about a year and a half ago, actually, starting with the Trump administration under some acts that try to proclaim that we needed to have patriotic education in the United States. For me, as a person from Guatemala, Central America, an indigenous person, that raises flags right away when we say patriotic education, because patriotic education for one person means something very different for another person. And the same frame was used in my country, Guatemala, Central America, to suppress the voices of indigenous people. And I think in the United States, we've had the same cause or the same language used, not only now, but we really did see it for many years before this. For example, after Board versus Brown Board of Education, we saw the same type of backlash that said, no, we don't want to talk about this anymore. We don't want to talk about race anymore. We don't want to, and these movements are not new. We saw it again in the 80s. We've seen it now after President Barack Obama was elected to office, and we're seeing it at this particular point in time. And so these are a whole set and gamut of laws that are using some very finely crafted language that seems really good on its face. However, when you really examine the language of the law, they are designed to suppress the voices of people of color, of LGBTQ plus people, of women, of poor people in very insidious ways.
This is true, and I like the fact that you talked about the language. And one of those words that they use in the anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion talks is blame or judgment. Can you talk about that just a little bit? Why is blame or judgment so important in these anti-DEI discussions?
I could break it down to what it is in the social sciences and sociology and so forth, but I'd rather just give you an example of how it works. Most of you and most of us have at some point in our life confronted somebody who was a bully, who didn't treat us right, who abused us in our life. And as you're confronting him, you hear these reactions, right? And those reactions usually say something like, no, I didn't do it, right? A resistance, or this did not happen, or it might be just wanting to move forward without actually dealing with the abuse, with the violence that was committed. It's almost exactly what's happening with some of these bills. it pretends that it wants to unify the country, but the way it pretends to unify the country is by suppressing those voices of people who have been hurt historically in the United States. If we look at it, slavery is an abuse of the people in the United States. Being confined, Japanese Americans being confined to concentration camps during World War II is abuse of Japanese Americans in the United States. The Trail of Tears, or the genocide of Native Americans, it's an abuse that the United States is a country committed against indigenous people, right? The lynching of Mexican Americans after the annexation of Texas in the southwest of the United States, those are abuses. And we, as populations that live as parts and partners in our country, sometimes need to get to that point of hearing the truth, of hearing our truth represented, not just one mainstream story.
I'm with you on that. So I want to go ahead and bring in our other colleague, Mr. Barry McNeely. Barry McNeely is a local historian as well as a high school social studies teacher. And he's going to help us with understanding how this may look in the classroom or when you're dealing with students on a personal or teacher level. And so, Barry, how you doing today, first of all?
It's doing very good. When I think of the idea of how this affects the classroom, uh, one of the things that just jumps out at me is this idea of what's been referred to as whataboutism. And in terms of our education, in terms of our learning, we have to take the lessons of the past to be instructive. And when I think of historian Doris Goodwin Kearns, she said that history is here to help. But when we interject whataboutism, we take away history's ability to help. In other words, with this wave of, anti-inclusive education, there's this idea that everything must be taught on an equal basis. And so, for example, you have to be able to teach uh, both sides of the Ku Klux Klan. And I don't know how you teach the good of the Ku Klux Klan when you are trying to put forth a lesson that terrorism, that racism, that bullying, just plain bullying, is not something that is a desired trait in society. When you're required to teach both sides of any controversial issue and you're not allowed to have a right or wrong because of whataboutism, then, as you know, Dr. Kern said, history's here to help, but you won't let it help. And so that's why I really think that it impacts and affects uh, true education. And to be honest, so many people have told us before, education is our only way out.
You know, Barry, I think I agree with you 100%. You know, I'm sitting here right now. If you look out my back, the back window, I sit right at the corner of where the 60th Street bombing happened, right? Uh, Something that is historical, but it is also not historical. The last parent of one of the children who died in the bombing just died last weekend,
Mhm.
right? uh, right over to my left, if you were able to see through the wall in my left shoulder, you'd see where the Children's March happened and what happened to them. But for some reason in these bills, it says that we cannot make people feel uncomfortable. We cannot create discomfort when we're talking about things like the bombing of a church and young ladies dying, because it might feel might make people feel uncomfortable. to me, that's really an important thing to kind of walk away from, because what ends up happening is that if we're not able to create some emotion, we're not able to create empathy.
John Paul, you just said that uh, the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, it's not left to history. And it's not, because we can easily put our hands on cases where mosques have been attacked and people have been killed in religious settings, and from South Carolina's Mother Emanuel to the synagogues in the Northeast. These things are history, but they're the present. And if we don't examine the initial things that have taken place in the past, again, it cripples the past ability to instruct us. History should not be a resume. It shouldn't be something that's put there to make us look good. It should be something that tells us what to do, but also what not to do. And when you step in and you start sanitizing history, you take away its total ability to be transformative.
Hmm.
It might as well be the Three Little Pigs.
Well, that's so serious. And so, John Paul, I wanted to ask you something directly, and I'm gonna jump on the elephant in the room and ride it around the room. But we're gonna talk a little bit about what exactly is CRT, and how did it become associated with diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Critical race theory is, it is something that they teach in law schools. They do teach it in education schools. They do teach it. But really, fundamentally, it's simply the word critical really comes, it's a really important part of this, which means I am being critical of the history, the sociology, the anthropology that's been taught so far. So in the 70s and 80s, we began to see these critical movements saying, you know what, it's not enough for anthropology to always treat people as they are the other. So everybody who is in the United States or Europe is normal, and everybody in Africa is the other and they're the abnormal, right? That's not okay. So we need to critique that. In law, we cite as critical race theory, saying the way we teach law in the United States may not be the most effective way, because it's stripping away the voices of so many other people, because laws have always been made by those people who have most power, the richest, right, in the country. Critical simply means looking at something and examining it from many different angles, right? And one of the things that we strive for in education, as an educator myself, both earlier in my life at the PK-12 level, but also at the graduate level, is critical thinking. I am trying to help youth think critically about issues, especially those issues that we take as assumptions, right? Why saying that, for example, why do we continue to repeat stories like George Washington had wooden teeth or grew a tree, and yet we keep on avoiding stories like the massacre that happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma, or how Native Americans were stripped of their land even when they were trying to do everything the colonial powers that be told them to do. And so we got to really think about what does that mean.
John Paul, let me hop on that elephant that Charles was mentioning. And the thing is that we talked about this idea that uh, somebody sitting in a classroom, their cultural ego might be bruised because of telling uh, or informing the actual events that have taken place. When you talk about the Trail of Tears, or when you talk about the Tulsa, Oklahoma, um, you know, bombing, when you think of those things and you think of somebody being uh, marginalized or hurt by the understanding that those events took place, we have to ask ourselves, and it's probably a question that might not have been considered as much as it needs to be. But we have to ask ourselves, why is there such an assumption that a a, a white child sitting in a classroom is going to be uh, identifying with the people who forced the Cherokee and the Native Americans along the Trail of Tears? Why couldn't they instead um, identify with the school teacher who filed a court case for the Cherokee and took this case all the way to the United States Supreme Court and won the right for those students, I mean those Native Americans, to stay exactly where they were? Why do we have to instantly assume that the white kid in the classroom is going to be bruised and harmed because he's going to instantly jump on the side of Andrew Jackson and say, "This is what we should do"? Why don't we think that he might identify, or she might identify, with the person that was trying to do the right thing?
And I think and take the lessons into the future, right?
Mhm.
Because then if we don't know this is how this happened, that it took a policy decision, it took orders from the government, it took the US military to make the Trail of Tears happen.
Yeah.
We need to know that in order to not do it again.
Right.
And if you don't see that, then we go into that often repeated phrase, history repeats itself. My response is, history repeats itself because we're not listening.
Right.
We tend to turn a deaf ear to the countervailing arguments of the time. We in terms of the people who uh, we might consider to be radical. But when we think of Charles Sumner, and we think of the fact that he spoke out against slavery, why must we just automatically think that kids are going to gravitate towards Preston Brooks, who picked up a cane and walked into the Senate chamber and beat this man bloody? Why, why can't we assume that students can learn from Charles Sumner's courageous stance and his words against slavery? Why must we constantly believe that we're always going to identify with Preston Brooks and the fact that he, had this hateful, racist view? We have to get past the idea that uh, that people are going to um, just naturally gravitate towards the negative. And it's an interesting thing to me as well. It's usually when it's U.S. history that these discussions come about. Uh, Charles and I, and John Paul, you and I were talking the other day about the fact that when it's talking about genocide in Rwanda, nobody closes their eyes.
Right.
They want to know everything about it. They want to know about the how they call people cockroaches and the weapons that they use. They want to know every last, and I'm told, to stray away from the Holocaust when making a point. But when we start talking about Adolf Hitler and the Nazis and what happened in Nazi Europe, in terms of the extermination, the attempted extermination of an entire group of people, we go through that chapter and verse. But when we turn the eyes on ourselves, when we turn the camera back on the United States, all of a sudden, we don't need to teach that. That might make somebody a little uncomfortable. That is why I say that history cannot be a resume. It can't be just designed to make us feel good about ourselves. It must be designed to make us good.
Make us better. Right.
Yes. It's
And
one thing to
that-
feel good. It's cool to feel good, but it's so much better to be
Be
good.
better. Right.
Mhm. Yeah, and that really gets to the silencing of the voices, right? So how do we live in a community? How do we live as a national community when our people of color, LGBTQ people are saying we're hurting, we're still being treated this way, and we can't acknowledge the pain of the past and the pain today? Why? Because it's too uncomfortable.
Hmm.
These discussions should be uncomfortable because
Yes.
discomfort makes you move. It advances you. It goes back to that idea of critical analysis, that idea that we have to think critically of the world. Because if we don't, words just become ideas without examination, right? And if we do that, then we all lose. We cannot apply the lessons of the past into the future. We
So
have
really,
to we have to have the unvarnished truth in order to be able to learn from it.
so really quickly, I want to add throw in another question, and then we'll start wrapping up. But so my question is: are bans on diversity, equity, and inclusion bans on free speech? Are they bans on truth? And are they bans on the true American history?
As the policy, and I have been reading policies not only in Iowa, but across, not only in Alabama, but Iowa and Texas and so forth, they all have some commonalities. And those are that the way that the bills are discouraged, are written, tend to be in order to discourage open conversation, right? They
Mhm.
a lot of times they're not even legally enforceable in many cases, right? However, they're used to create wedge issues between communities of color, LGBT communities, and white communities. So they are doing so the language that they always use is you can't talk about race because it's divisive, right?
Mhm.
But the reality is that in our country, we need to talk about race. That's where we're going to find the healing. We can't keep on putting it out here in the box because if you are a person of color in this country and you have lived in this country, you have to be able to find some way of dealing with the trauma that you have as a person. And we should not take away that from our kids.
Yeah, and I would just dovetail and first of all say I totally agree with everything you just said, John Paul. And I dovetail that to say we cannot move together as the nation that we were intended to be. And when I say that, what I mean is that uh, America, the United States of America, is a creedal nation. What brings us together is not the the family line. It's not lineage. What brings us together is not the ownership of a particular district or a particular province. What brings us together is a belief in shared ideals. And if we can't come together and believe in the ideals of equality and justice, and when we talk about Jefferson and um, all men being created equal, if we can't really discuss those ideals, those creeds, um, on an honest basis, on an inclusive basis, then our experiment uh, that is this country, it doesn't have a good outcome. Eventually, if we can't talk to each other and learn from each other and appreciate each other's point of view, eventually, then people will start pulling at the threads of this fabric that is the United States of America. It's Benjamin Franklin, and I had to be an adult before I understood what a stitch in time saves nine means. But if you rip your shirt, if you don't stop and sew that up, then that rip is going to continue all the way up until the shirt is no good. And when it comes to this division that we have about our shared stories, that's a rip in our fabric. And until we can have those difficult discussions are what bind those rips up and bring us back together stronger than we were before. But if we allow that rip to just keep spreading, God knows where those fissures will go.
Man, this was excellent. I want to thank you two dynamic individuals for being here with us today. I want to thank the NAACP Legal Defense Fund as well as Project Say Something, our partners on this project that we're doing today. And I just want to say one last thing. Yes, we are the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, and like John Paul said, we are at the corner of the epicenter of the civil rights movement and the change that occurred in the civil rights movement, with the efforts that happened here in Birmingham with people like Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth and A.G. Gaston and other leaders here in this city. But at the same time, we all do have a shared experience. We have a shared experience in this country. We have a shared experience in this world, and everybody's story deserves to be told. And so until we can all come together and understand that in order for us to have a bright future, we have to understand the past collectively and understand everyone who is represented in that past. And so I just want to say thank you to all that's watching, and thank you to my colleagues that participated in this discussion today. And I want to say, please stay connected to the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. Our website is www.bcri.org. And we have programming coming up for King Day, which is January 17th, 2022. So thank you once again. And you gentlemen have a good rest of your day. And just want to say thank you, and we'll pass it on to the next part of the program. Thanks a lot.